Picture this: a freezing January morning in 1351. At Talavera de la Reina, inside a damp stone dungeon, where a thin blade of light slips through a crack in the wall. There, a woman who once lived among gold, silk, and power trembles on the cold ground. The hands that once wore the most precious jewels of Castile are now shackled in rusty iron. The black hair that once made a king kneel is tangled, dirty, and heavy with sweat. That woman was Leonor de Guzmán, the most powerful royal mistress in Castilian history. For 16 years, she was not just a lover but a queen in the shadows, daring to rival and even eclipse the legitimate queen. She bore Alfonso XI 10 children, built a parallel court in Seville, and openly defied the unwritten laws of medieval Europe. But now, in the thick darkness, she was no longer the radiant lady of the palace. She was a prisoner awaiting death, dragged into a cycle of revenge with no escape. And tonight, you will see we are not just telling the story of a fallen woman, but stepping into the nightmare of power itself, where love and hatred merge into one. To understand how Leonor de Guzmán rose from obscurity to the very center of power in medieval Castile, we need to return to the turbulent early 14th century, a time when the Iberian Peninsula was a patchwork of kingdoms, wars, and feuds, and when noble families saw marriages, betrayals, and bloodshed as legitimate tools for survival. Leonor was born around the year 1310 in Seville, the daughter of Pedro Núñez de Guzmán and Beatriz Ponce de León. Her family belonged to the lower ranks of the nobility, with some lands in Andalusia but nothing compared to the great houses that controlled the fate of the kingdom. By birth, she was not destined for greatness, yet destiny often hides in unlikely places. And in Leonor's case, it revealed itself in the form of her beauty, her intelligence, and an ambition that no convent walls or arranged marriage could contain. The chroniclers of the time describe her with almost reverent fascination: hair as dark as polished ebony, skin pale and luminous like ivory, eyes sharp and penetrating, and a presence that commanded attention whenever she entered a hall. But more than her beauty, it was her mind that set her apart. While most young women of her class were trained only to be obedient wives and mothers, Leonor showed early signs of a calculating intelligence and a natural magnetism that made her impossible to ignore. In a world where women were expected to remain silent, she sharpened her voice into a weapon, and where others were content with survival, she was already plotting her ascent. The opportunity arrived in 1325, when Alfonso XI ascended the throne of Castile at only 14 years old. He was bound in a political marriage to Maria of Portugal, a timid and pious woman chosen to strengthen ties between kingdoms. That marriage was, in truth, a contract, without love, without passion, and without the force to anchor a restless young king. Alfonso, by all accounts, was virile, ambitious, and eager for both power and pleasure. The court knew that their union was fragile, and in such a fracture, a woman bold enough and brilliant enough could carve out a place for herself. Leonor entered court in 1327, only 17 years old, brought by relatives who hoped that her beauty might win her a favorable match. Perhaps some minor lordship or protection, but fate had grander designs. Alfonso XI, at 21, noticed her almost instantly. What began as attraction quickly deepened into an obsession. Unlike other kings who kept their mistresses discreetly behind closed doors, Alfonso raised Leonor up in plain sight. He gave her lands, wealth, and titles, and most scandalous of all, he installed her openly in the royal Alcazar of Seville, treating her with the honors of a queen, while the legitimate queen was forced into the shadows. This was not merely an affair, it was the creation of an alternate court, a second power that mirrored and often overshadowed the first. Leonor, with her youth, beauty, and sharp mind, became the true center of Alfonso's world. Every nobleman saw it, every court lady whispered it, and Maria of Portugal endured it as a daily humiliation. The rise of Leonor was swift, dazzling, and dangerous, for she had seized the very heart of the king, and through him, she had begun to seize the kingdom itself. What makes the story of Leonor de Guzmán so extraordinary is not simply that she captured the king's heart, but that she transformed that love into political power on a scale unseen for any woman outside the crown. From the year 1327 onward, she did not live like a hidden mistress in some discreet chamber. She lived as though she were queen in all but name. Alfonso XI entrusted her with decisions that shaped the kingdom, consulted her on matters of war and diplomacy, and showered her with lands, so vast they rivaled the holdings of dukes and grandees. By the middle of the century, Leonor controlled territories across Andalusia, Medina, Sidonia, Alcalá de los Gazules, Jimena, each one a piece of a growing dominion that bore her mark. Her court at Seville became a rival to the official one at Burgos. Chroniclers wrote that her halls were filled with musicians, foreign envoys, and petitioners who bypassed the queen entirely, knowing that Leonor's voice was the one the king listened to most. Ambassadors reported directly to her, nobles sought her favor for appointments, and decisions of state were whispered in her ear before they were ever proclaimed by Alfonso. It was as though Spain itself had two centers of gravity, one ceremonial, with Maria of Portugal, and one real, with Leonor. Every child Leonor bore for the king, 10 in total, was acknowledged publicly, paraded with titles, honors, and privileges. The firstborn, Pedro, was named Count of Trastamara, establishing the line that would one day challenge the throne itself. With each birth, Maria of Portugal's humiliation deepened, and with each grant of land or title, Leonor's dynasty of bastards grew closer to legitimacy. It was a living reminder that in Castile, the power of love and ambition could eclipse the sanctity of the crown. Imagine the scene while Maria fulfilled her duties as a queen in silence. Standing in formal processions, Leonor sat at Alfonso's side, her sons lined up like living banners of her triumph. She was young, beautiful, and magnetic, the embodiment of a new kind of power, unofficial yet irresistible. It was a defiance of every medieval rule, and it could not last forever. But for 16 years, Leonor de Guzmán ruled from the shadows with more authority than many crowned queens ever tasted. And in doing so, she lit the fuse of a rivalry that would not burn out until blood had soaked the kingdom. Fate has a way of rearranging power in a single heartbeat. And for Leonor de Guzmán, that heartbeat came in the spring of 1350. Alfonso XI, the man who had lifted her from obscurity to the pinnacle of Castile, marched to the southern frontier to lay siege to Gibraltar. The Black Death, that relentless phantom sweeping across Europe, had already reached the camps. Soldiers coughed, priests whispered hurried prayers, and the stench of plague clung to the air like a curse. In March, Alfonso succumbed, struck down not by sword or rival, but by the invisible hand of disease. With his death, the world Leonor had built began to collapse, stone by stone, until nothing remained but chains and shadows. Alfonso's heir was not one of Leonor's many sons, but Pedro, the legitimate child of Maria of Portugal. He was only 16, young enough to be shaped, but old enough to remember every humiliation his mother had endured. For years, He had watched her forced to sit silently while Leonor paraded her beauty, her influence, and her brood of royal bastards. He had seen his mother's face tighten as Alfonso raised Leonor above her, had felt her bitterness grow with each passing year. When the crown finally rested on Pedro's head, it was not only a coronation, it was an inheritance of vengeance. Maria of Portugal, now Queen Mother and Regent, wasted no time. The death of Alfonso freed her from the long shadow Leonor had cast, and she seized her chance with a swiftness that suggests she had been waiting for it her entire life. In the weeks following Alfonso's burial, proclamations spread across Castile. Leonor was declared an enemy of the state, her estates confiscated, her children stripped of privilege. Overnight, princes became fugitives. Their birthright turned into a curse. Leonor, still in Seville, tried to negotiate. She offered to surrender her lands, to retreat into a convent, even to live out her remaining days in silence, if only her life and her children could be spared. But Maria, hardened by nearly 2 decades of humiliation, was not interested in compromises. She wanted more than Leonor's exile. She wanted her ruin, her pain, and her blood. In September of 1350, betrayal found Leonor, one of her own allies, tempted by promises of pardon and reward, revealed her hiding place. She was captured while trying to flee toward Aragon, hoping to find refuge with Pedro IV, who might have used her and her sons as pieces in his own political game. Instead, she was dragged back in chains, her once radiant image deliberately broken down. The woman who had lived in palaces was paraded like a criminal. Her hair was cut, her jewels stripped away, her body wrapped in the coarse fabric of a prisoner. Every act was symbolic. The queen in shadows had been reduced to dust. They sent her to Talavera de la Reina, a fortress already infamous for its damp cells and cruel executions. There, Leonor endured months of degradation, designed not only to kill her body but to crush her spirit. She was kept in cold darkness, fed barely enough to survive, interrogated endlessly for the location of hidden treasures or conspiracies involving her children. Torturers broke her fingers, burned her feet with hot iron, yet she refused to yield. Witnesses noted her courage, her refusal to beg for mercy, her insistence that she had been the true wife of Alfonso, not his concubine, and that her children were princes by right of blood. This defiance only enraged Maria further. For the Queen Mother, it was not enough to strip Leonor of dignity. She needed her broken, humiliated, and erased. The cruelty of Leonor's captivity shocked even hardened chroniclers. They wrote only in fragments, using veiled phrases like extraordinary torments to describe tortures too savage to record in full. But even in agony, Leonor would not bend. Her silence became louder than her screams. Her refusal to submit a final act of rebellion. In January of 1351, the end arrived. Leonor, her body frail and battered, was led into the courtyard of Talavera. She stood tall, her back straightened as if she were once again in the royal halls of Seville. The crowd waited, some with pity, others with grim satisfaction. Before the rope was tightened around her neck, she spoke her last words not to her executioners, but to her absent children. "Tell my sons that their mother died as a queen, and that the blood of Castile runs in their veins." It was a final blow to Maria, a declaration that even death could not erase Leonor's claim to dignity or her son's claim to power. Her execution was deliberately cruel. Instead of the swift blade of a noble death, she was strangled slowly with a hemp rope. The punishment of common criminals, her body was left hanging for hours, a warning to all who might challenge the Queen's authority before being buried in an unmarked grave. The woman who had ruled in shadows for 16 years was erased as if she had never existed. Yet Maria's vengeance did not bring peace. If anything, it ignited a fire that would consume Castile for decades. Leonor's sons scattered, but they did not forget. Her second son, Enrique de Trastamara, swore vengeance. Over the next years, he rallied allies, bided his time, and waged war against his half-brother Pedro, who came to be known as the Cruel. Pedro's paranoia grew, and he ordered the deaths of several of Leonor's sons, even killing one of them with his own hand inside the Alcázar of Seville. The cycle of revenge spun faster, drenching Castile in blood. In 1369, nearly 20 years after Leonor's execution, Enrique caught Pedro at the Battle of Montiel. In a moment that felt like destiny completing itself, he killed the king with his own hands and seized the crown. The bastard son of Leonor de Guzmán became Enrique II of Castile, founder of the Trastamara dynasty. It was the ultimate irony the woman executed as a traitor had given birth to a line that would rule Spain for 2 centuries, producing the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, and reshaping the future of Europe. When we step back, we see that Leonor's fall was not just personal, it was the spark for a civil war, the kindling for a dynasty, and a reminder that vengeance, once set in motion, rarely ends with a single life. Maria of Portugal may have destroyed her rival, but in doing so, she planted the seeds of her own family's downfall. Castile would bleed for decades because of 2 women locked in a war of pride and humiliation, a struggle that began in whispers at court and ended in screams on the battlefield. And if you listen closely, in the silence of Talavera's old stones, you can almost hear her last words, still echoing not the voice of a mistress, not the cry of a prisoner, but the defiant declaration of a queen who refused to die quietly. When the rope tightened around Leonor de Guzmán's neck in January of 1351, many at court believed that was the end of her story. A mistress destroyed, a rival silenced, a name buried in an unmarked grave. Yet history rarely obeys the wishes of kings and queens. And in Leonor's case, death was not an erasure, it was a beginning. Her fall planted the seeds of vengeance, and her children watered them with steel and blood until they grew into a dynasty. Her second son, Enrique, carried his mother's last words like a torch. He refused to accept life as a fugitive, refused to let her memory rot in the dungeons of Talavera. Decades of rebellion, ambushes, and shifting alliances followed until, in 1369, Enrique met his half-brother Pedro the Cruel at the Battle of Montiel. With his own hand, he struck the blow that ended Pedro's life, avenging not only years of rivalry, but the humiliation of his mother. That single act did more than settle a score. It ended the legitimate line of Castile and crowned a new dynasty, the Trastamaras, whose blood would flow into the veins of Ferdinand and Isabella, the monarchs who united Spain and sent Columbus across the ocean. And so, the woman strangled as a traitor became, in death, the matriarch of a line that ruled Spain for 2 centuries. Irony wrapped itself around her legacy like ivy around stone, the concubine who governed as queen, the criminal who birthed kings, the victim whose death became the cornerstone of an empire. Maria of Portugal had sought to erase her, but instead she carved Leonor's name deeper into history. Yet Leonor's memory was never simple. Chroniclers argued endlessly. Some painted her as a manipulative temptress who corrupted a king and plunged Castile into chaos. Others saw her as a brilliant strategist, a woman who seized the only tools available to her: beauty, wit, ambition in a world that denied women formal power. perhaps both are true. She was cruel at times, humiliating Maria beyond necessity, wielding her influence with a sharpness that cut, even when discretion might have sufficed. But she was also courageous, refusing to surrender her dignity even under torture, walking to her death with her head held high, her words echoing through generations. What lingers is not only the tragedy of her end, but the mirror it holds up to her age. Leonor and Maria were not merely two women locked in personal hatred, they were pawns and players in a patriarchal game that reduced queens and mistresses alike to instruments of power. One gained everything through defiance. The other endured humiliation until revenge was her only language. Both were victims of a system that treated their bodies, their children, and their lives as pieces on a board of kings. 7 centuries later, Leonor de Guzmán's name still carries a strange fascination. She is remembered as a shadow queen, a pioneer of female power, and at the same time, a symbol of how ambition and vengeance can twist history into a spiral of blood. Her story reminds us that unofficial power can be as dangerous as the crown itself, and that private rivalries, when magnified by monarchy, can shatter entire kingdoms. The irony is almost cruel. The woman executed like a criminal gave Spain some of its most celebrated monarchs. Her enemies sought to erase her from memory, but her bloodline carved itself into the destiny of Europe. And if you close your eyes, you can almost see her standing tall in that courtyard, whispering to her children across the centuries, "Your mother died a queen." Close your eyes for a moment, and imagine the stones of Talavera under the moonlight. They are silent now, worn by centuries of rain and wind. But once they carried the weight of footsteps, the rattling of chains, and the final gasps of a woman who refused to bend. If you listen long enough, the silence itself seems to murmur her name, Leonor. Not the Leonor of silk gowns and feasts, but the Leonor who walked into death unbroken, her shadow stretching far beyond her grave. Her execution did not simply mark the fall of a mistress. It cracked open the heart of Castile. The nobles who had once bowed before her watched nervously as factions sharpened their blades. The common people whispered that a woman had ruled more boldly than a queen, and that her death would not bring peace, but fire. And indeed, the fire spread civil wars, betrayals, and assassinations that turned the kingdom into a battlefield for more than a generation. It was as though Leonor's last breath had carried a curse, one that lingered in every corridor of power. Think of Pedro the Cruel, the legitimate son who inherited the crown but not the love of his people. His reign became a hunt, each year bloodier than the last, as paranoia gnawed at him and vengeance stalked his every move. He killed his half-brother Frederic with his own hands, staining the royal palace of Seville with fratricide. Yet every murder only deepened the cycle his mother had begun, and every cry of the dying seemed to echo Leonor's defiance. Enrique, Leonor's son, did not forget. Imagine him in exile, brooding over his mother's last words, gathering men and gold, forging alliances in the shadows. His rebellion was not just about power, it was about rewriting his mother's death, turning humiliation into triumph. When he finally faced Pedro at Montiel, it was not only two brothers clashing, but the collision of two legacies, the queen who had been despised, and the queen mother who had sought vengeance. History, of course, crowned Enrique. From him came the Trastamara line, a dynasty born from illegitimacy, carried on the shoulders of a woman who died in disgrace. And yet, her blood gave Spain Isabella and Ferdinand, the monarchs who united the crowns, toppled the last Moorish kingdom, and set sail toward the unknown world across the ocean. Every map that changed, every conquest that followed, carries a trace of Leonor's shadow. And here lies the cruel irony. Maria of Portugal believed she had won. She believed that by strangling her rival, she had restored dignity to the crown. But what she achieved was fleeting. The memory of her reign dissolved into the margins of history. While Leonor's defiance survived in the steel of her children and the crowns of her descendants, the woman Maria tried to erase became, in the end, unforgettable. Tonight, as we leave this story behind, remember, this history is not a neat tale of kings and queens. It is a labyrinth of love turned to rivalry, of ambition sharpened into knives, of women forced to fight in a world that denied them any weapons but their beauty, their wit, and their will. Leonor de Guzmán lost her life. But she gained something more terrible and more enduring, a place in the memory of a nation, not as a concubine, not as a criminal, but as the ghost who reminded Castile that no dynasty is safe when vengeance flows through the blood of its heirs. And if, while drifting into sleep tonight, you hear a faint whisper, soft, proud, almost regal, it may just be her voice, still insisting across the centuries. Tell my sons their mother died a queen. Leonor's body may have been lowered into an unmarked grave at Talavera. But her story did not end in the cold soil. It seeped outward, like ink spilling across parchment, staining every corner of Castile. The Queen Mother, Maria of Portugal, believed she had finally cleansed the court of the humiliation she had endured. Yet even as she triumphed, a darker truth was already forming. Vengeance does not die with the body. It lives on in the blood. Imagine the kingdom in the years after Leonor's execution. The court was split like a mirror struck by a stone. On one side, Pedro the Cruel and his mother, clinging to the legitimacy of law and crown. On the other, the children of Leonor, bastards in name, but princes in every other sense, scattered across Iberia, whispering promises of return. Every noble house had to choose support the young king or gamble on the sons of the woman who had once ruled in shadows. It was a dangerous choice, for Pedro's wrath was legendary, and Leonor's sons were relentless. Civil war erupted like a fever. Towns declared allegiance only to change sides days later. Families split apart, brothers drawing swords against one another in loyalty to rival claimants. The chronicles speak of entire villages burned, of banners shifting above castles like weather vanes in the wind, of priests blessing armies that marched not against infidels, but against fellow Christians. It was as though Leonor's strangled breath had unleashed a storm that no one could contain. Pedro himself descended deeper into cruelty. He trusted no one, not even those who fought at his side. In his paranoia, he struck down nobles. He suspected of treason, ordered assassinations of his half-brothers, and even killed Fadrique, master of Santiago, with his own hands. The act shocked even hardened warriors. For to spill blood in the sacred halls of Seville was not only murder, it was sacrilege. Yet Pedro seemed almost to revel in the fear his actions inspired, as if each death could erase the ghost of Leonor. But ghosts are stubborn things. Meanwhile, Enrique de Trastamara, Leonor's second son, became more than an exile. He was a symbol. Foreign courts welcomed him, not out of kindness, but out of calculation. France, Aragon, and even the papacy saw in him a weapon to weaken Pedro. Soldiers of fortune flocked to his banner, mercenaries hardened by the 100 Years' War, men who cared little for causes but hungered for gold and glory. Enric promised both, and in his eyes burned not only ambition, but the memory of his mother's death. The war stretched across decades, until it seemed less a conflict of men and more a curse laid upon the land. Crops withered, famine stalked villages, and ordinary people, peasants, craftsmen, Widows became pawns in a feud that had begun with a king's passion for one woman. Children grew up knowing nothing but war, their lullabies replaced by the clash of steel and the screams of the dying. And then came Montiel. The year was 1369. The battlefield dry and hard under the Castilian sun. Pedro was cornered. Desperate. His forces dwindling. Enrique struck like the judgment of fate. And in the final confrontation, brother met brother. Chroniclers say Pedro was lured into a tent, believing he would negotiate safe passage. Instead, he found Enrique waiting, blood in hand. The struggle was brutal and intimate. No armies, no courtiers. Only two sons of Alfonso, grappling like beasts, until Enrique plunged his dagger into Pedro's chest. The king fell, and with him, the line of Maria of Portugal. Leonor's ghost must have stirred that day, her humiliation avenged, her legacy secured, her blood crowned in the figure of Enrique II, first king of the Trastamara dynasty. It was as though she had reached from beyond the grave, guiding her son's hand, completing the vengeance she could not carry out in life. But even then, the story did not rest, for the Trastamaras would go on to shape Spain's destiny through alliances, 2 wars, and the union of Ferdinand and Isabella, whose marriage would create the Spain we recognize today. The fall of Granada, the voyage of Columbus, the forging of an empire that stretched across oceans, all of it can be traced back, in part, to that January morning when Leonor refused to bow her head, when her last words consecrated her children as heirs of her defiance. So, when we speak of Leonor de Guzmán, we are not speaking only of a mistress, a victim, or a queen in shadows. We are speaking of the spark that ignited wars, the bloodline that reshaped kingdoms, and the paradox of a woman destroyed in life, but immortal in death. Her grave may be unmarked, but her legacy is carved into the very bones of Spain. Centuries have passed since the rope at Talavera silenced Leonor de Guzmán, yet her presence still lingers in the chronicles of Spain, like a shadow that stretches across generations. Her death did not vanish into the dust of the 14th century. It became a story retold by courtiers, whispered by peasants, and debated by historians, each adding their own layer of interpretation. Some remembered her as a dangerous temptress who undermined the queen and fractured the kingdom. Others hailed her as a woman of genius, who dared to wield power in a world that denied her every right to it. And so, Leonor exists in memory as both villain and victim, as both manipulator and martyr. The dynasty born from her blood, the Trastamaras, ruled for nearly 200 years. It was her son Enrique II who set the crown upon their brow. But it was her defiance and survival instinct that pulsed in their veins. From this line came Ferdinand of Aragon, who through marriage to Isabella of Castile forged a unified Spain. Their reign saw the fall of Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Iberia, and the voyage of Columbus, which carried Spanish banners across an ocean. In a sense, every conquest, every treaty, every palace built in their honor carried a fragment of Leonor's legacy, proof that the woman buried in an unmarked grave had shaped empires. Yet the shadow she cast was not only glorious, it was bloody. The wars between Pedro the Cruel and Enrique drenched Castile in violence, left thousands of commoners dead, and scarred the land with famine and ruin. The rivalries she embodied became a pattern that repeated again and again in Spain, ambition clashing with legitimacy, love entangled with politics, vengeance spiraling into civil war. To speak of Leonor is to speak of the price of power when private passions become public disasters. Even today, her story unsettles. She was neither saint nor monster, but a mirror of her age, an age in which women were expected to be silent and obedient, yet could still, by wit and will, bend the fate of kingdoms. Leonor's fall warns us of how fragile power is, and how easily personal hatred can fracture an entire realm. Her last words, proclaiming herself a queen in death, remind us that dignity can survive even in defeat. Walk through the old castles of Castile, and you may still feel her presence. The halls of Seville, where she once ruled beside Alfonso, the stones of Talavera, where she was broken, the battlefields where her sons fought and died, all bear her imprint. History buried her as a criminal, but memory resurrected her as a queen in shadows, a woman whose defiance echoed long after her body was gone. That is the long shadow of Leonor de Guzmán, a life that began in obscurity, blazed in forbidden love, ended in torture and disgrace, and yet endured, shaping the destiny of Spain itself. She remains a paradox, a ghost at the edge of every coronation and rebellion, a whisper in the blood of kings. And if you stand in the silence of a ruined fortress, the wind carrying faint echoes of chains and prayers, you might hear her voice still calm, proud, and unbroken. Tell my sons, their mother died a queen. The fall of Leonor de Guzmán did not merely rearrange the crown of Castile, it rippled outward, touching every throne and council across the Iberian Peninsula. To Portugal, her death was seen as a triumph for Queen Maria, proof that dynastic honor had been restored. Yet in Aragon, whispers carried a different tone. King Pedro IV, ever alert to weakness in neighboring realms, saw opportunity in the sons of Leonor, to shelter them, to use them as bargaining chips, to dangle them as rivals to Pedro the Cruel. This was the game of kings, and Leonor's children became pieces no less valuable than fortresses or fleets. Foreign courts leaned in as well. In France, where dynasties fell like dice, thrown across a tavern table, Leonor's story was told as both a caution and a curiosity. A woman who ruled without a crown, undone not by her own ambition, but by another woman's vengeance. It was a tale fit for firesides and warnings. Yet for mercenaries along the Pyrenean border, it was something more practical, a promise that Castile was unstable, ripe for profit. Wherever Leonor's name was spoken, it conjured both fascination and fear. Meanwhile, within Castile, the common people bore the heaviest weight. Taxes soared to fund endless campaigns, while noble houses shifted loyalties as easily as changing banners in the wind. Villagers whispered about Leonor's ghost. Some swore to see her wandering the roads at night, her chains rattling, her voice calling out to her sons. These stories were not mere superstition. They were the language of a people trying to explain why their fields burned, why their lords fought each other instead of foreign foes, why the kingdom seemed cursed since the day she died. Pedro the Cruel ruled with iron and suspicion. But suspicion is a double-edged sword. His mistrust of allies made them enemies. His violence bred resentment. And each execution planted seeds of rebellion. Leonor's song, scattered but not silenced, grew into symbols of resistance. To support them was to defy Pedro, but also to believe in the dignity Leonor had claimed with her last breath. Even peasants, who had never glimpsed the splendor of Seville or Talavera, spoke her name as if she were a saint wronged by earthly injustice. The irony deepened with every passing year. Maria of Portugal had hoped to erase Leonor, but by destroying her, she had carved her more deeply into Castile's memory. Where Maria's own legacy faded into the role of a bitter queen mother, Leonor's expanded into myth, the mistress who became a monarch without a crown, the mother whose bloodline reshaped the kingdom, the woman whose death unleashed a war that would decide the fate of Spain. And the war did not stop at Castile's borders. Neighboring realms learned that Leonor's sons could be weapons as sharp as any sword. Enrique forged alliances with France, bargaining with promises of loyalty in exchange for soldiers hardened by the 100 Years' War. Aragon saw him as a counterweight to Pedro, while even Navarre and Granada calculated their positions. Leonor's shadow stretched far beyond her grave. She was no longer just a Castilian tragedy, but a force tugging at the entire balance of Iberian power. If you look at the centuries that followed the rise of Trastamara, the union of Ferdinand and Isabella, the voyages that carried Spain to the edges of the world, you see her fingerprints everywhere. Though faint, like cracks beneath a painting, for every decision her descendants made, from marriage treaties to battles fought, there remained the memory of a mother's defiance and a queen mother's vengeance. And so, Leonor's story did not end at Talavera. It lived on in every coronation of a Trastamara king, in every rebellion that echoed her children's rage, in every foreign court that invoked her name as shorthand for the danger of women who dared to wield power. Her rope may have snapped her breath, but her shadow endured longer, perhaps, than that of the very queens who condemned her. The chronicles of kings are written in gilded ink, but the memory of Leonor de Guzmán was etched in blood and whispers. Her story did not stay confined to dusty manuscripts. It became part of the cultural bloodstream of Castile, a cautionary tale retold in monasteries, in noble halls, and even in the taverns of Toledo and Burgos. For some, she was remembered as a serpent, the temptress who eclipsed a lawful queen and pulled a king into disgrace. For others, she was a heroine, a woman who carved her own throne in a world designed to deny her one. In the decades after her death, songs and ballads about Leonor began to circulate among the people. Minstrels sang of the Shadow Queen who loved too fiercely and paid with her life. Some verses painted her as cruel, mocking Maria of Portugal until vengeance finally crushed her. But other songs softened her image, casting her as a tragic figure, a mother whose children were hunted because of her defiance. In these ballads, she became less a mistress and more a martyr. Her voice carried not in court, but in the refrains of those who lived and died far from the palaces. Politically, her memory was weaponized. The Trastamara dynasty, born from her blood, did not hide its origins but rather leaned into them. Enrique II, once crowned, subtly reframed Leonor's disgrace into legitimacy. Chroniclers close to his court reshaped her as the rightful consort of Alfonso, hinting that their love was more genuine than any political marriage could ever be. In doing so, Enrique turned his mother from traitor into founding matriarch, ensuring that her humiliation was recast as destiny. Meanwhile, opponents of the Trastamaras continued to invoke Leonor as a warning. In foreign negotiations, ambassadors whispered that Castile was cursed because of her, that a dynasty rooted in bastardy and vengeance could not last. The papal curia itself debated her influence, some clerics condemning her as a symbol of sin that had led Castile into chaos, while others argued that she was merely a scapegoat for the failings of men who should have ruled with justice. Thus, even in death, she became a pawn in the very political struggles she had once mastered. Century later, as Spain expanded into an empire, Leonor's memory lingered like a faint shadow in the background. Historians of the Renaissance rediscovered her tale, often highlighting the irony of her fate. A woman strangled as a criminal whose bloodline went on to command the mightiest empire in Europe. Poets and playwrights occasionally resurrected her image, presenting her as a ghostly figure who stood between love and vengeance, a reminder that personal passion can topple kingdoms. And among the people, superstition held fast. In villages near Talavera, elders swore that her restless spirit still wandered the countryside. They claimed to hear the clinking of chains in the night, to see a woman draped in tattered black crossing the fields at dusk. Mothers frightened their children into obedience by warning them, "Do not defy your fate, or Leonor will come for you." Her ghost became part of folklore, not as a royal mistress, but as a spectral judge of pride and ambition. This duality, legendary temptress on one side, tragic martyr on the other, ensured that Leonor was never forgotten. Her name carried weight long after queens and kings more powerful than she had turned to dust. Every time a Trastamara king ruled, every time Isabella and Ferdinand claimed to be the heirs of destiny, Leonor's blood flowed in their veins, her shadow in their legacy. Blood gave her descent on crowns, memory gave her immortality. And together, they ensured that Leonor de Guzmán, the woman once left hanging from a rope as a warning, would outlast those who condemned her. The rope that ended Leonor de Guzmán's life did not end her story, it merely redirected it into the veins of her children. From Enrique II of Castile, her surviving son and avenger, stretched a dynasty that would alter not only Iberia, but the map of the entire world. For nearly 2 centuries, the Trastamaras held the crown, weaving marriages and wars into a fabric of power that would eventually cloak all of Spain. By the 15th century, Leonor's blood flowed in the 2 most critical branches of Iberia, Castile and Aragon. From Enrique's line came Isabella of Castile, a queen every bit as formidable as her great foremother. From the Aragonese branch came Ferdinand, whose inheritance extended across the Mediterranean. When Isabella and Ferdinand wed in 1469, it was not only a union of kingdoms, it was the fulfillment of a legacy Leonor could never have imagined. The bastard sons she bore, in defiance of a queen's authority, had, through the slow grind of history, produced the Catholic monarchs, rulers whose power would eclipse anything Alfonso XI or Maria of Portugal ever dreamed of. Their reign was a crucible. In 1492, the same year they completed the Reconquista by capturing Granada. They also sponsored Christopher Columbus, sending him west into waters where only rumor and fear had sailed before. That decision ignited the age of discovery, opening oceans, continents, and empires. The dynasty born from Leonor's scandal now extended its reach not just across Iberia, but across the Atlantic, into the New World. Her shadow stretched over cathedrals in Mexico, fortresses in Peru, and ports in the Caribbean. But even as the empire expanded, Leonor's paradox remained embedded in its foundations. Her descendants bore the same contradictions. She had embodied glory and cruelty, ambition and bloodshed. The Reconquista ended with the forced conversions and expulsions of Muslims and Jews, victories celebrated as divine yet soaked in suffering. Columbus's voyages brought riches, but also conquest, disease, and devastation for the peoples of the Americas. The empire of her bloodline was both magnificent and merciless, a reflection of the same duality that defined her life. Still, in the grandeur of Ferdinand and Isabella, one cannot miss Leonor's ghost. It was her defiance that set Enrique on his path, her death that forged his determination, her children who clawed their way from bastardy to majesty. Without her, there is no Trastamara dynasty. Without the Trastamaras, no Isabella and Ferdinand. Without Isabella and Ferdinand, not unified Spain, nor Columbus, no empire upon which the sun never set. Irony drips from this chain of events like wax from a candle. A woman strangled in a dungeon, erased from the record as a criminal, becomes through her blood the mother of an empire. Maria of Portugal, who sought to annihilate her, left behind only the memory of bitterness, while Leonor's name lived on in palaces, treaties, and ships that carried Spain's banner across the seas. And perhaps that is the greatest vengeance of all. Not the dagger at Montiel, not the crown Enrique seized, but the slow, unstoppable march of history, proving that Leonor's legacy was indestructible. The empire of her descendants was not built in spite of her disgrace, it was built because of it. History did not bury Leonor de Guzmán, it transformed her. Long after the banners of Trastamara had faded, and the Bourbon dynasty sat on Spain's throne, her name still flickered in chronicles, plays, and whispers. She ceased to be just a mistress who dared too much. She became a mirror for questions that have haunted Spain for centuries. How far can ambition carry a woman in a world built to silence her? And what price does she pay when that ambition collides with power? In the golden age of Spanish literature, playwrights and poets revived Leonor's tale, reshaping her image, according to their own times. Some painted her as the archetypal femme fatale, a woman whose beauty corrupted a king and plunged a kingdom into chaos. Others, especially in the Romantic tradition centuries later, cast her as a tragic heroine, a victim of love and politics, destroyed not by her sins, but by the vengeance of others. In these retellings, the dungeon of Talavera was not just a prison, but a stage. Her strangulation, a symbol of how patriarchal power crushed women who refused to accept the roles assigned to them. Artists, too, could not resist her. In engravings and paintings, Leonor sometimes appeared as a regal figure, her dark hair spilling across embroidered gowns, her gaze fixed not on the king but on the horizon, as if she were already imagining a crown of her own. Other images were darker, Leonor in chains, humbled and broken, her beauty dimmed by suffering. Each portrayal told as much about the anxieties of the age that produced it as about Leonor herself. Modern historians have continued the debate. Some read her as an opportunist, ruthless in humiliating Maria of Portugal, reckless in building a dynasty of bastards that destabilized Castile. Others view her as a pioneer of female power, a woman who refused to be confined to the shadows and instead forged a place in the center of politics, only to be punished precisely for daring to play the game that men played without consequence. Feminists, scholars, in particular, have claimed her story as a case study in how history punishes ambitious women while excusing the violence of kings. Even outside academia, Leonor's ghost lingers in Spain's cultural memory. In Talavera, where she died, locals still tell of a woman in black walking the ruins at night, her chains clinking softly, her face pale in the moonlight. For some, she is a warning. For others, a guardian spirit, watching over women who dare to defy. Schoolchildren learn her name as both scandal and legend, and tourists trace her steps in Seville, where she once ruled a palace that rivaled the Queen's. In the end, Leonor de Guzmán lives not in the pages of dusty chronicles, but in the ongoing struggle to define her. Was she a villain or a victim? A seductress or a strategist? A mother betrayed or a queen who never wore a crown? Perhaps she was all of these at once. That complexity is why she endures, why she resurfaces whenever Spain looks back at its past and asks itself who truly shapes history: the kings who signed decrees, or the women who, in shadows and whispers, bend destiny to their will. And so, Leonor remains what she always was, a paradox. The rope silenced her voice, but memory amplified it. She died as a criminal, but her descendants ruled as monarchs. She was erased from stone, but carved into legend. Her afterlife, more than her life itself, is the proof that shadows can be stronger than crowns, and that some queens never stop ruling, even from the grave. When we step back from the smoke of battlefields and the echo of dungeon chains, Leonor de Guzmán's story reveals itself as more than a tale of one woman's rise and fall. It is a lesson, a mirror, and a warning. For beneath the jeweled crowns and silken robes lies a truth as old as power itself. Ambition and vengeance may win thrones, but they always leave scars. Leonor's life teaches us about the fragile boundaries of love and politics. She entered history, not as a queen, but as a mistress, and yet for 16 years she wielded authority that reshaped a kingdom. In her, we see the paradox of women in medieval courts denied official titles, yet able to bend kings and councils by presence, wit, and force of will. Her defiance reminds us that history is never just the story of kings, but also of those who dared to rule without crowns. But her death is the darker lesson. Strangled as a criminal, abandoned in an unmarked grave. Leonor's fate shows how quickly power turns to dust, how swiftly loyalty dissolves when a protector falls. It reminds us that the games of court intrigue, though gilded, were nothing more than struggles for survival, where one misstep or one death by plague could unravel an empire. The vengeance that consumed Maria of Portugal is another warning. She won her triumph. Yes, but that triumph birthed civil war, soaked Castile in blood, and left a dynasty fractured for generations. From this, we learn that vengeance, once unleashed, rarely ends where it begins. It spreads outward, infecting sons, kingdoms, even entire eros. And yet, Leonor's legacy offers a final, haunting paradox. Though she died disgraced, her bloodline crowned kings, united Spain, and launched an empire across oceans. The very dynasty that defined the future of Europe was born from the womb of a woman history tried to erase. It is a reminder that even in defeat, even in disgrace, influence can survive, passed down in whispers, in blood, in memory. So what do we carry from her story? That power is seductive, but never secure. That women, even when silenced, can shape the destiny of nations. That vengeance may destroy, but memory can also rebuild. Leonor de Guzmán remains, centurilateur, a voice in the shadows, whispering to us that history is not just about crowns, but about the human hearts that beat behind them, hungry, wounded, and defiant. And perhaps tonight, as you let the weight of this story settle, you will feel that whisper close to your ear. Tell my sons their mother died a queen, not just for them, but for every soul who ever dared to claim dignity in the face of ruin. The candles burn lower now, their flames trembling like tired hearts, painting long shadows on the walls of memory. We have followed Leonor de Guzmán from the gilded halls of Seville to the damp dungeons of Talavera, from the passion of a king's embrace to the cold silence of a rope. Her life has carried us through decades of love and vengeance, through the birth of dynasties and the ruin of kingdoms. And though her body was left in an unmarked grave, her voice still lingers, faint but unbroken, like a whisper moving through the centuries. Think of all we have seen tonight. A young woman rising from obscurity, dazzling a king, building a parallel court that eclipsed the queen herself. Think of the bitter queen mother, biding her time until vengeance became her only companion. Think of the sons born of scandal, hunted, scattered, yet destined to carve their names into the throne itself. And finally, think of Leonor, walking to her death, with her back straight. Her words meant not for her executioners, but for her children and for history. Tell my sons their mother died a queen. Now, close your eyes and let these images soften. The echoes of swords, the cries of courtiers, the chains rattling in dark corridors, all of it begins to fade, dissolving like mist at dawn. What remains is the lesson of her life, that power is fragile, that vengeance never ends, where it begins, and that even in disgrace, dignity can endure. Let yourself drift with that thought. Imagine the silence after the final drumbeat of war, the quiet that falls when the last torch is extinguished in the castle halls. The night air is cool. The stars stretch endlessly above. And history, with all its blood and brilliance, folds itself away like a book, set gently on a shelf. And you safe? Still, listening can allow the weight of it all to slip from your shoulders. For Leonor's story has been told. Her shadow has walked beside us. And now she returns to the silence from which she came. So breathe deeply. Let the hum of the night become your lullaby. Let the memory of Leonor de Guzmán recede into the quiet, where whispers turn to dreams. Sleep softly, knowing that even the heaviest stories can settle into peace, and that history will wait patiently for you when the morning comes. Good night.